Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Quinny Sanchez Lopez. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the advisor for the Digital Identity Community of Practice, which is a project of the Digital Benefits Network at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. Thank you for joining this Q&A on access and safety and service design and digital identity. If you're just joining us, I ask you to please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and pronouns, your organization and role, and something that brought you joy this week. So joining us on today's call are three additional members of the Digital Benefits Network. Ariel Kinnan is our Senior Director of the Digital Benefits Network. Elizabeth Bynum-Sorrell is the Senior Manager for Research and Engagement on Digital Identity. And Elisa Fox is the network's Program and Data Manager. They will be managing the chat, collecting your questions, and providing tech assistance. If you run into any issues throughout the call, please use this chat feature to raise any of your concerns, and one of our team members will be able to provide support. Before transitioning to our program, I want to take a moment to remind us of the group's community norms and code of conduct. Our desire for this is for this to be a space where everyone is respected, nuances are explored, and we give each other opportunity to grow. That said, there are a few things that we will not tolerate in this space, and that includes harassment of any kind. If you have questions, we kindly ask that you take a moment to review our expanded norms and code of conduct document and to reach out to our team via email. The link to those norms are going to be in the chat as well as the email that you can contact us about. During today's session, we will hear from two groups of stakeholders advancing equity and access to public benefits for underserved communities, while simultaneously supporting digital identity initiatives to maintain program security. We will first hear from Hannah Quay-de la Vallee of the Center of Democracy and Technology, who's going to share about equity, access, and privacy pertaining to government technology. She will be followed by Devin Nguyen and Julia Ford of AidKit, who will discuss human-centered design for equity for digital identity systems. The second half of the call will be a question and answer format in which we will alternate questions between our two speaker groups. If you have questions for our speakers, we ask that you type them into the question and answer portion of the Zoom platform. If you're on mobile, that's going to be on the top of your screen. If there's a question that you would like to see answered based on what's already there, we ask that you upvote it by giving it a thumbs up. We're going to return to these questions in the second half of the call for the last half hour. In an effort to share valuable information from our speakers with the rest of our public benefits ecosystem, we will only be recording the first half of the call, which will be shared on the Digital Governments Hub. To respect the privacy and encourage participation, we will stop recording when we get to the question and answer portion of the call. All right, so now for what you all came here to do, we're going to hear first from Hannah Quay-de la Vallee, who is a senior technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. While she brings her technical expertise to bear across CDT's projects, she's primarily focused on equity and civic technology project dedicated to ensuring that education agencies and other civic institutions use data and technology responsibly while protecting the privacy and civil rights of individuals. Hannah received a PhD in computer science from Brown University in 2017. For her dissertation, she designed and built tools that will help users better manage privacy on their mobile devices. All right, Hannah, take it away.
Thanks, Quinny. And I would just say the fact that you can say my last name without pausing now means we're like officially close colleagues. Like that's when I know I've worked with somebody enough to be like, yeah, we're buddies. So as Quinny mentioned, I work for an organization called the Center for Democracy and Technology. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is a over 25-year-old nonpartisan tech policy organization. We have a very wide mandate. Basically, anytime tech and policy are kind of in the same universe, we're excited about it. And I work on particularly on the equity and civic technology team, which focuses on all of the ways that people interact with their government mediated through technology. Generally other than law enforcement, which is a separate set of folks at CDT, but there's obviously overlap there. And our mission is really making sure that as governments adopt and begin to use technology, that we're really reaping the benefits of those tools while at the same time being equally obsessed with ensuring that they're governed well and that the harms and other issues that can arise from these tools are managed and mitigated and dealt with. So obviously today we're here to talk about ID management and public services, and there's a few different considerations I wanted to talk through. So Quinny, you can jump to the next slide. So there's a number of considerations here in the building an identity management system in a government context that works for everyone. So obviously privacy is a big one, accessibility, another one, equity, and then also I'll talk a little bit about deployment in context, and I'll jump in a little bit to what that means when we get there. So kicking us off with just privacy, Quinn, if you want to jump to the next slide. Identity management, kind of by virtue of what it does, can be a data-heavy endeavor. And the sensitive nature of government services means that privacy is like a particularly critical value in this particular context. These are often, as you all know, like people dealing with very sensitive situations, so their privacy is top of mind for people. And one thing that's really critical to think about there is that collecting and maintaining data is always going to carry risk with it. So anytime that you have a data point, that you're keeping a data point around, it's on you to protect and defend that data point and make sure that it's used appropriately, stored appropriately, all that good stuff. A really great way to do this is collecting only what you need when you need it, right? So this is a sort of like in context data collection. It's often referred to as a data minimization approach as well. And what that really means is collecting data for a specific purpose at a specific moment in time and having a sense of how long you intend to maintain that piece of data, what you intend to use it for, and pretty critically, when you intend to get rid of it. And that can benefit both users and the agency, right? So obviously from the user side, that's a privacy protective approach. And from the agency side, again, if you're collecting and maintaining data, that's risk that you're taking on and it's responsibility that you're taking on. So consequently, not collecting data that you don't need wipes a couple things off your to-do list right off the bat. So there's a real value into that data minimization approach. And a flip side of this is that unnecessary or even seemingly unnecessary data collection can discourage applicants from applying or from completing an application, or in some cases from completing an application in the way that would make the most sense both for them and for the agency. So one way to think about this is this, what I mentioned earlier, is this data collection in context, right? So collecting data, even data that you know that you'll need later on, at a moment in time where it does not make sense to the user to give it to you, is going to create some sort of friction there, right? So having this sense of both what you intend to use the data for and how you're communicating that to a user, because users are going to have a sort of, whether or not they would say it this way, users will have some sense in mind of like what they expect to give you for this process. And if there's like a mismatch between what they expect to give and what they're being asked to give, that's going to end up creating barriers for them, which may mean that they, drop out from the application, but it may also mean that they are then searching for other paths to complete it, which is then more of a burden on the agency to try to help get those people through the process. Onto the accessibility side. So Quinny, if you want to jump to the next slide. Governments, as you all know, have a particular design challenge. The system has to work for everyone from the get-go, right? You'll often see in the private sector, people are able to just limit what, decide, you know what, that's a set of users we're not going to deal with right now. Maybe that's a product expansion in the future. Maybe we'll deal with it later. Or maybe we're just saying, our product is, we're just deciding it's available to these people. That's obviously not something governments can do. And in particular, in the benefits context, you're often dealing specifically with people who have perhaps the biggest challenge of getting through something like an identity management system, particularly one that's mediated through technology. But a couple things to bear in mind on that front is that accessible systems are often better systems. So there's obviously, when we talk about accessibility, there's both accessibility from a disability standpoint, but also from a language accessibility standpoint, a technology accessibility standpoint. There are people who will need those accessibility frameworks. There are also people who don't need them. but will enjoy them. So the example that I talk about is like a ramp into a building, right? You may not need a ramp, but someday you'll be like rolling a dolly and it will be really, really helpful to have that ramp, even if it's not something that you explicitly need. And that carries over into technology too. And another part of this is that, again, that usable system is that functional system. So even if a system has all of the like technical capabilities it needs, if the people who need to use it can't operate those capabilities, whether they can't find them or they're not available to them on the particular internet speed they have or whatever it is, that's like not ultimately a functional system. Like maybe it is in a like very technical, like the best kind of right is technically right kind of way, but it's probably not like an actually functional system. Which leads us into the equity considerations, which are tied into the accessibility considerations, but there are some distinctions there. So Quinny, if you want to jump to the next slide. These are kind of going beyond things like language accessibility, disability accessibility. These are kind of ways that your customer base is going to differ across other axes, right? So one I mentioned on the slide before is things like how good is your internet? Another one might be a thing of like, how old is your smartphone? Or do you have a smartphone? Do you have an email address that goes back 5-10 years? Like these are all things that for some percentage of the population, the answer is like, yeah, sure, of course. And for other parts of the population, the answer may be no, or not always, or sometimes, or only when Mercury is in retrograde. And so because of that, it's important to bear in mind that no one solution is going to work for everyone, right? Optionality is going to be critical because it is very unlikely that your user population will ever be homogeneous enough that like one or two paths through your system are going to work. And the other thing to bear in mind is that as your population shifts, your system may need to as well. And there are some like legal underpinnings to these systems. So certainly from like accessibility standpoint, you would be looking at things like the ADA. From some of the equity standpoints, you'd be looking at things like the Civil Rights Act. But especially in a technological context, it's really important to remember that like the legal frameworks are really the floor, not the ceiling. And newer laws may reflect some of what we would expect to see with some of these things. So example is HIPAA being a more recent privacy law, that's the health privacy law, does have some like explicit technical considerations in there about like, in preserving privacy, you think about things like data encryption. Other laws are, it's very easy to match the letter of, or it's possible to match the letter of the law in a technical way without meeting like the spirit of things like accessibility and equity. So those legal frameworks can help you like issue spot where these things come up, but they're not going to really ultimately serve you as far as building a truly functional system. And Quinny, if you want to go to the next slide. So when we say truly functional system, one theme that's sort of threaded through all of these considerations is that systems only ever exist in a deployment context. And whether or not something works or is functional or is usable is only answerable sort of within that context. So that means, collecting information is contextually relevant, means like it makes sense to the user in that context. So assessing a system in context means looking at things like who is able to work their way through the system and who isn't. It's providing pathways for your actual users, not some theoretical set of like users that may exist somewhere in the planet. And so looking at those systems in context is like a really key part of ensuring that the system is ultimately functional for the people that you expect to use it, meaning both your user population, but also you all and like the people you work with. So building a system that works across the board is going to have to make sense in that deployment context. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to the folks who can talk a lot about what that deployment context looks like and how to do some of that measurement.
Thank you, Hannah. I really appreciated that context and you framing it in that way. If you haven't had a chance to submit any questions that you have for Hannah, please do so by typing them into the Q&A log. Don't forget to upvote questions that you'd like to hear answered on the call. Next up, we'll hear from two representatives from AidKit about their approach to human-centered design and identity verification. Julia Ford is equal parts a dreamer and a doer and believes deeply that transformations start with the people we're supporting, not the systems we're changing. She has worked at the intersection of nonprofits and technology as a fundraiser, business development leader, program manager, and partnerships director, with recent roles at HubSpot, Monera, and ThinkShout. She currently leads the partner success team at AidKit. And Devin Nguyen leads the product engineering team at AidKit, where he leads initiatives around accessibility and fraud mitigation. Prior to AidKit, he worked in cloud infrastructure management and cybersecurity with a focus on passwordless authentication, identity verification, and working with the FIDO Alliance to make sure accessibility and to ensure accessibility of passwordless solutions. So Julia and Devin, the floor is yours. And I'm going to stop sharing.
I think you
Julia,
can unmute,
you're
Julia.
muted. Mhm. There
Great.
you go.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. I think Devin and I could sum up our entire presentation by saying heavy +1 Hannah. So we're gonna do our very best to differentiate a bit and give you some real world examples. And Quinny, thank you for the lovely introduction. It's been a joy to join the AidKit team and see sort of a culmination of more than 15 years in the field, and really excited to chat with you all today about the ways that we are really thinking mindfully about bringing identity verification to a best practice standard that works for everybody. So if we think about today, what Devin and I are going to do is show you that robust IDV creates fraud resilient public programs without sacrificing accessibility or privacy. One of the things that we want to make sure that we do is define success for today. So we will have done our jobs if you walk out of here with two things. First, an understanding that engaging the community that you're going to be serving during your program design phase, and then carrying that engagement through implementation should be non-negotiable. And second, a grounding and an understanding that implementing community-informed and enabled IDV is actually a cost saver over time. So to Hannah's point, you do it right, you do it once, you evolve it, and it saves everybody time and money. We're gonna really take advantage of our 15 minutes. So I'll start with a brief background because AidKit's origin story is actually fundamental to understanding how we've evolved over the last 5 years and how we've gotten to this practice of human-centered design balanced with fraud mitigation and IDV today. And then Devin is gonna share a real-time case study that is in flight right now that everybody can reference. So we being AidKit, came out of something called the Left Behind Workers Fund in Colorado during the early days of the pandemic, when there was a recognition by community members that undocumented workers were being excluded from federal relief and that they were this vital part of the workforce, and everybody was worse off for them not being supported in the way that all workers needed to be supported. So working through a nonprofit, Impact Charitable, who to date is still one of AidKit's biggest partners, we helped establish a $38 million fund, the Left Behind Workers Fund. And that fund was a combination of private and public dollars geared towards providing economic stabilization to these workers. And the challenge at that time was that there was no existing infrastructure that could safely and securely administer funds while protecting workers, employers, and the state. So AidKit was created as this third-party intermediary solution to successfully get money out the door to more than 25,000 people while safeguarding privacy. And this effort has evolved into now a public benefit corporation. We power more than 50 direct cash and benefit programs across the country. And we do everything from refugee resettlement to baby bonds to rental assistance, wage boost programming. And the Left Behind Workers Fund is now in some ways codified into law. And we run the benefit recovery program, which is an unemployment assistance program for workers without authorization in Colorado. And I say all of this because that founding ethos and methodology of building for folks who are undocumented, who might be unhoused, who might not have bank accounts, it really is, as Hannah mentioned, this ability to say, you're building the ramp. Somebody might not need the ramp right now, but they're going to need it in the future. And if we build to be as accessible as possible, it benefits everybody. So that is always our through line at AidKit. And the way that we continuously ground in that is to be responsive. And any single partner or program that we encounter as we seek to employ our platform and our services, we're asking key questions about who we're trying to reach and how. What is the baseline verification that we need to collect and essentially prove? How are we going to assess validity? What is the risk tolerance for the program, for the partner, for the funding entity? What educational and enablement materials are required? And that is from a community-centered perspective, right? So like for the people who are going to be applying and receiving funds, benefits through the program, and for the folks who are going to be administering. And then which partnerships, community-based, are going to strengthen all of these efforts. I'm going to pass to Devin just to ground us. We have some shared language around IDV and KBV. I think it's important when we start to talk about our actual use case.
Yes, thank you, Julia. So some folks on the call might already be familiar with these concepts, but just to level set and set the stage here, IDV and KBV, knowledge-based verification. At AidKit, we don't use KBV. We're focused on using identity verification. So we confirm applicant identity through document uploads, biometric data uploads, things like that. And we're informed by the NIST IAL guidelines, so the Identity Assurance Level guidelines, in our implementation of these fraud controls. It depends, typically depending on the program's risk profile and risk tolerance, like Julia mentioned. On the other side, knowledge-based verification. This is the traditional question and answer format where the answers are based off of known data sources, right? But the main problem with this is that oftentimes you can find those answers in data breaches or social media even. So think mother's maiden name, addresses that are associated with someone. So while it may seem cheaper and faster to implement KBV, I just want to highlight what I think are two main cost drivers when implementing IDV. First is the cost of those checks, any third parties that you're using, of course. But second, and just as much of a cost driver, is the manual review and customer support that you'll have to do. And so in KBV, if folks don't know the answers or they forgot the answers, you're really funneling a lot of that verification to manual review, and that drives up the costs behind this. Next slide, please, Julia. So this is how we think about fraud at AidKit. I think first we should establish that security is not a perfect practice. It's a contextual one. I think Hannah touched on this already. And what that means is that we work with our partners during the program design phase to understand their risk tolerance, their risk profile, and really where they need to be on this sliding scale. And the sliding scale is that accessibility and fraud are really two opposing forces, right? Because as you ramp up your fraud controls and tooling, you're inherently reducing accessibility to your program, right? You're becoming less tolerant of the edge cases, and you might actually add undue burden to applicants who are seeking aid. Conversely, if you open it up too widely, then you run the risk of fraudulent actors entering your program. So at AidKit, we've found success in taking a holistic approach to all of this and combining people, processes, and these security controls to really build out our fraud framework. And so part of that holistic process is partnering with community-based organizations. That helps us balance the automation with human review. I think the key piece here is this also allows us to build trust with the communities that we're serving because we're partnering with folks who are already in that community. The key thing here too is that it's a continual education cycle for us, both of us, both AidKit and the programs that we work with, because as we start to see more use cases and edge cases out in the field, we can adapt and adjust accordingly. Next slide, please. I just want to give a quick overview of how we've been able to implement this fraud framework in a real program. So AidKit recently partnered with LA County on 2 programs to help folks that were impacted by the wildfires in LA back in January. And because this is an emergency disaster relief program, you can imagine that LA County was very keen on distributing aid very quickly. And so we had to work with them to strike the right balance between fraud and accessibility. And there's also the unique element where folks might not have the documentation because it was destroyed in the fires, right? So at baseline, we have IDV and liveness for remote identity proofing, but we're also partnering with over 65 resource centers across LA, including the 2 main disaster recovery centers that LA County has set up. And that allows us to give technical assistance to folks, but it also allows us to provide in-person attestation pathways, what's called trusted referee in security. And so between all of these people and processes, we're able to maintain a strong fraud posture, but also distribute aid to those who need it most. And with that, I'll hand it over back to Julia to close us out and give you a preview of the ROI you can expect.
Awesome. Thanks, Devin. Yeah, I think if we go back to the idea of this double-sided coin and a spectrum, and then also apply that to this idea of what's available online for somebody to self-serve versus how you really empower community organizations to be resources, both proactively and retroactively for folks, we think about creating a holistic environment, right? Like the safety net is a net. It involves real people. And so when AidKit goes to market, essentially in any new program, we really want to make sure that we're leveraging folks on the ground who are already deeply embedded. And that could be seen as, oh my gosh, like that's a lot of cost. That's people power, that's tech power. And what we want to make sure that we're like really hammering into everybody is when you design this way from the beginning, and when your software is incorporating these human elements, it actually does have overarching quantifiable cost savings. And so when we look at industry standards in different program areas, so unemployment insurance, disaster relief, refugee resettlement, these are just very quick snapshot. I didn't go into depth of every single sector, but if we look at the industry average cost per recipient, so think about this as like your full program administrative cost, right? Including person power, including technology, we see that AidKit, and this is really not a plug for AidKit, I just want to make sure everybody's grounded in that. This happens to be the data that we have, but by implementing these human-centered, but still very fraud resilient program methodologies, we're actually saving anywhere between 20 and 70% when it comes to cost per recipient across all industries. So hopefully that's grounding for folks of, if you do it the right way and you continuously evolve and you're continuously bringing community in, not at the end, but at the beginning, it results in faster time to launch and more efficient program structures and administration costs. And that is the end. How are we doing on time, Elizabeth?
As the timekeeper, I can tell you, you did amazing. You did great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both so much for that information. It's really valuable, and we really appreciate hearing AidKit's approach to human-centered verification.